Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the struggle for food and other resources in Stalin's Russia during the 1930s. Now, my go-to guide on this, as ever, is Sheila Fitzpatrick's brilliant book, Everyday Stalinism. And it's a book I can't recommend highly enough to anyone studying the Soviet Union during the 1930s. The companion book to this is Stalin's Peasants, which tells the other part of the story, mainly in rural Russia. Now, she discusses shopping as a survival skill in the second chapter of the book, which focuses mainly on the shortages in terms of food and housing that existed during that period. And Sheila Fitzpatrick writes, with the outlawing of private enterprise at the end of the 1920s, the state became the main and often the only legal distributor of goods. All large social goods like housing, medical care, higher education and vacations were distributed by state agencies. The citizen obtained them by making an application to a relevant bureaucracy. The bureaucracy would weigh the claims according to various criteria, including the citizen's social class. Proletarians had the highest priority, disenfranchised class aliens the lowest. Almost always, there were long waiting lists because the relevant goods were in short supply. After the citizen's name came to the top of the list, he or she was supposed to be allocated an apartment of the appropriate size or assigned a vacation place. Apartments and resort places did not come free, but charges were low. For most of these large social goods, no legal private market existed. So the removal of market mechanisms led to the introduction of bureaucratization into nearly every aspect of life. The kinds of calculations as to how resources would be allocated, which had previously been left to markets, were now forced to adhere to bureaucracy. And bureaucracy was essentially inserted into places that it can't naturally go, just as one critique of neoliberalism now has markets being inserted into places that they tend not to be able to adequately function, and ironically leading to a kind of an excess of bureaucracy again. But of course, the reason for the elimination of markets in what would previously have been privately traded goods was purely ideological, and it was a way of reordering society so that favoured classes, such as workers, now gained the lion's share of resources, and former people, the enemy classes, would receive the lowest. Market traded commodities such as food and clothing had a variety of sources. The state and state-owned stores and other outlets were places that food were sold, yes. However, peasants were also able to sell their own produce in the kolkhoz markets. However, this really gives the illusion of competition. The state-owned stores were never really in any kind of meaningful competition with the peasants because they weren't motivated by any kind of profit motive. They weren't exposed to any kinds of market forces. Therefore, they're not under any pressure to produce different or more preferable goods at more competitive prices. Markets were replaced with bureaucratism in an immense hurry. They were not replaced with any prior thought. There had been little planning, and this was during a period of immense social crisis in the Soviet Union. And so, as a result, it's hardly surprising that central planning in Russia failed. Centralised planning of the distribution of food, clothing, housing and other resources didn't lead to the kinds of disasters that happened as a result of collectivization, i.e. the deaths of millions. And indeed, starvation doesn't happen in Soviet cities, but immense hardship does. And there's always a fundamental difference between hunger and starvation. But for those who lived through the late 1920s and early 1930s, it was a time of shortages, of hunger, and of struggle to really survive. There had been a few periods like it since the actual civil war itself. So what Stalin created was an ideologically inspired economic crisis in Russia in the bids to reorder Russian society, to essentially proletarianize Russian society, which would have a knock-on impact on the power and the popularity of the party. The distribution of consumer goods has a brief turnaround in the mid-1930s, and there's a brief turnaround during the late 1950s, early 1960s, during the Khrushchev era. There is an excellent book out there, Red Plenty, which is a kind of semi-fictionalized account of life under Khrushchev. Well worth a read. It has excellent plaudits from academic circles. As I've discussed it with, I'll have to research the author. Francis Spufford, I think is the chap's name. Check it out. Anyway, but for the rest of the period of the Soviet Union, with these two notable exceptions, the mid-30s and the late 50s, early 60s, the provision of material resources is never fully resolved or succeeded in any successful way, and this arguably has a huge impact on the eventual downfall of Soviet communism. There seems to have been little thought about what a socialist economy should look like and how a socialist economy should function. The normal refrain about socialism is that it's a nice idea in principle but a lousy one in practice. Seems to have been, whether it's true or not, unfortunately proven here by Stalin's poorly thought out economic ideas. The removal of private purchase and resale of goods as the kind of the evil of speculation was not replaced by any prior thought through economic model. For example, the communists didn't really have any idea that what they were proposing might lead to scarcity, that there might not be price signals running through the system giving information to producers as to what to produce and in what volumes. There was no understanding that the creation of a state monopoly to distribute goods would confer on the bureaucracy an allocative function, and a function of distributing resources and allocating resources that would eventually mean that there would be powerful implications for the relationship between state and society, as well as for social advancement. I.e., if you want to get your hands on some resources, then you have to become a party member. Or if you don't like the resources you're being allocated, then it is not the fault of a private business, it is the fault of a public bureaucracy and the party. What the Soviet leadership believed was that distribution was really a secondary issue, and that it was, in an economy, it was production that mattered. This was their particular reading of Marxist economics. The apathy that the Stalinists had for trade as a means of distribution meant that instead rationing had to be the way in which goods were allocated. The other method could be described as closed distribution. A closed distribution system is a system whereby goods are allocated through shops that are contained within party buildings, within party headquarters, within certain industries, certain factories and workplaces. And it meant that if you worked in a favoured factory or workplace or government bureaucracy, then you could have access to the store. And if you didn't, then you were shut out of that branch of consuming. And this became a glaring inequality within the Soviet system, one of the many. And it meant that it became a permanent feature of the allocation of resources within the USSR. And it very quickly creates a new state-led class system in Russia. Elite classes are those with access to consumer goods, attractive places to live, automobiles, and other luxuries. These options are rationing, and the closed system of distribution were the strategies that were there as a result of economic crisis. They were not necessarily ideological choices. A Soviet ideologue would no doubt have wanted neither to have existed, and abundance for all. However, the realities were that these were not obtainable under the Soviet system. There were few enthusiasts for rationing, as it represented a failure by the state and an admittance of Soviet poverty. There were the odd extremists and radicals who had believed that the rationing of the war communism era represented most directly what Soviet communism should be. However, they were very much at the fringes of economic thinking. Rationing was abolished in 1935, and Stalin presented this as a major step forward towards socialism and the achieving of the good life under socialism, evidence that communism was ultimately obtainable. Though, as a result of the Second World War, rationing is again introduced from 1941 to 47. So, from 29 to 35, from 41 to 47, constitutes about 50% of the Stalin era, where ration cards were necessary. And even during the periods of time where rationing was supposedly abolished, local authorities and local parties across Russia periodically reintroduced it in the late 1930s when there were shortages, as there frequently were. Rationing began in 1928 to 29 in cities such as Odessa, as the struggle between Stalin and the kulaks, the peasantry, intensified, as it became harder and harder to extract surplus food from the countryside. And the use of rationing was in some ways a political tool in order to harden feelings towards the Russian peasants, to present them as greedy hoarders causing suffering to hard-working proletarians who are the real source of the support for the revolution. It should be remembered that, in fact, there was an abundance of grain during the period of collectivization, the late 20s to the early 1930s, because it was being exported. So at the time when there was hunger in the cities and starvation in the countryside, Stalin was exporting grain out of Russia in order to buy equipment to industrialize Russia with. Those who were on the lowest rung of society, the former bourgeoisie, people who had once been in the priesthood, those who had been in very unfashionable professions like being netmen and traders, or perhaps those who had owned taverns and beer halls. These were the people who were normally ineligible for a ration book at all. This affirmative action was known as proletarian preference, so it meant that the working classes had access to resources first. However, there's a fundamental problem with all of this, and that was the closed distribution system. So it meant that proletarians could be given ration books, and plenty of them, but whether they had access to the stores which sold the goods and services that they actually wanted, or that were desirable, was a different matter altogether. Perhaps instead of seeing it as proletarian preference, you could see it as party preference, and it was party members that generally tended to benefit the most. During the period of the first 5-year plan, there is a dramatic expansion in state-run cafeterias, often referred to as enterprise cafeterias. There were 30,000 of these during the first 5-year plan. By July 1933, 2/3 of the population of Moscow and 58% of the population of Leningrad were fed by them. This was meant to protect the working population from the worst effects of shortages, and it was meant to link food to employment, or food to work. And this is one of the most fundamental aspects, I believe, of Soviet communism. Because what work meant in the Soviet system was the building up of socialism itself to reach a point of technological advancement where communism is achieved. So the whole point about the Soviet era was it was meant to be a time of work and struggle, that socialism was not, in theory, meant to be particularly easy, because it was going to be the creation of the utopia of communism would be the easy, nice, pleasurable bit, where a fully automated society, in theory, would exist in order to provide the levels of material goods. So by associating food and work, the Soviet system created some of the kind of the brutalities of the more Dickensian aspects of the capitalist world, that if you don't work, you don't eat. And it was a very conditional welfare system that was designed to motivate work. And there is a mirror between this kind of association between food and labour and the imprisoned variety in the Gulag system. Even when the closed distribution system was officially abolished, it was clear that this had not died out. Sheila Fitzpatrick writes, "Closed distribution was officially abolished in 1935. 6 months later, however, inspectors at the Ministry of Internal Trade noticed that some shops were reserving goods for special groups of buyers, creating various forms of closed provisioning." So what this meant is that influence and Blatt, which is this Soviet term for kind of networking and clientism and favoritism, was still at work within the Soviet system. And after 1935, an unofficial version of the closed system emerged, as opposed to the official version. And even though it was forbidden, the practice continues because local elites across Russia want it to continue. For example, in Alma-Ata, there were long bread lines, which emerged in provincial towns in about 1939. The authorities there established closed stores which only individuals who were on the list were admitted. And enterprises and factories all over Russia had their own closed cafeterias and restaurants and snack bars. So what was happening here is that under the pressure of shortages which were created by the Soviet system and by Russia's economic hardships in general and decades of crisis since the First World War, the Soviet system was actually destroying any notion of socialism or solidarity by creating closed shops and closed restaurants and cafeterias, guaranteeing an enhanced quality of life for a select few and hardship for the majority. And this was the only way in which the party could maintain its preferential treatment of its own in the face of hardship and shortages. It was how, basically, Soviet communism adapted to the realities of economic shortage. State-owned department stores and cooperatives had low prices, they had long queues, but crucially, they had shortages. There were the options to go to kolkhoz markets and the state-run Torgsin shops. These were the commercial stores, but these were only possibilities if you had the money. So the unauthorised and illegal but party-sanctioned stores and cafeterias, which were reserved for a select few, were places that were guaranteed to offer low prices and actually have the foodstuffs and the goods on the shelves that were actually demanded. So the only way in which the distribution that previously a market system would have operated worked was through gerrymandering the rules of the bureaucratic state-led system in order to create a kind of paradoxical black market which existed within plain sight, which the party officially sanctioned and banned, but unofficially actually approved of and gave the nod to. Such are the absurdities of totalitarian societies. And between the markets, the Torgsin shops, the kolkhozes, and the closed distribution system, there were black marketeers coming backwards and forth, ensuring that those without, who were willing to pay a high price, got the resources that they needed, within reason, of course. All of this exists alongside a state system that enforces the ban on the operation of markets as fairly ineffectively, but periodically with immense brutality and draconian prison sentences. And it shows you that ultimately markets seem to be these naturally occurring phenomena that are almost the kind of the function of human thought. Anyway, I'll finish there, but if you found that useful and you'd like to help support the Explaining History podcast, do check out our Patreon page. I'll put a link below in the blurb bit of the podcast, and you can join our Explaining History community on our Facebook group, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Thanks. Bye-bye.